Hey there, sleuths. Welcome to the Detective's Den, your one-stop spot for unpacking mysteries, cracking cases, and diving deep into the unknown. I'm your name, and I'll be your guide on this investigative journey. Globe showing Europe, Africa. Now tell me, from which corner of the globe are you tuning in today? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's see just how far our detective network reaches. Chapter 1, Midnight at Scotland Yard. Inspector John Luther leaned back in his creaking leather chair, the dim amber glow of his desk lamp cutting a sharp ellipse through the surrounding shadows. The late July rain outside hammered mercilessly against the tall, old windows of Scotland Yard, as if London itself were trying to scrub away the city's sins at this dead hour. Puddles pooled in the narrow gutter below, reflecting the street lamps' flickering neon halos. Inside, the grinding gears of the building's ancient heater grumbled in protest, and Luther felt the familiar ache in his shoulders. Another long night ahead, another mystery pressing on his mind like a weight he couldn't set down. He glanced at the stacks of manila folders piled high, each labeled in his neat handwriting: robbery, Brixton High Street jewelers, missing persons, East End, suspicious fire, Whitechapel, and, on the very top, a freshly printed alert bearing the National Gallery's official seal. His heart had skipped when the message first reached him. A Turner sketch, valued at over £2 million, had vanished from its glass case. All that police guards had found at the scene was a lone white glove, laid carefully on the pedestal as though placed with deliberate intent rather than dropped by accident. Luther reached for the folder. The soft rustle of paper echoed through the room. Inside were photographs, the gleaming empty frame, the polished marble plinth, and the glove, immaculately tailored Italian leather, pristine, without a smudge of dust or drop of blood. He studied the close-ups. The stitching was flawless, the seams hidden so skillfully they might evade all but the keenest eyes. What struck him most was the theatricality of it, the boldness to leave such a calling card in plain view. Whoever had done this wasn't merely stealing art, they were staging a performance, and Scotland Yard had just become their audience. A swell of adrenaline pushed away Luther's fatigue. He rose and moved to the tall window, brushing condensation away with the back of his hand. Below, a lone taxi crawled through the deserted courtyard, its yellow headlight slicing through the murk. He thought of the gallery's grand neoclassical facade, the heavy columns, the stone lions, and how, within its hushed halls, tourists barely a day before had admired the Turner's precise strokes of storm-tossed waves and battered coastlines. Now it was gone, spirited off in the dead of night, leaving nothing behind but an empty frame and a tantalizing taunt. From his sideboard, he poured a measure of dark whiskey into a chipped tumbler and took a slow sip, the liquid warming him from the inside out. The familiar burn steadied his thoughts. There was method here, of that he was certain. Slip in, take the prize, leave a mark. But why the glove? He set the glass down and opened the folder's accompanying memo. The guard had been dutiful, had heard no alarms, had glimpsed nothing suspicious, save the shadow of a tall figure slipping past the rotunda doors at precisely 2:14 a.m. The guard's watch face flickered in his memory, 2:14. Precise to the minute. A plan orchestrated with military precision. Luther lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. He hated smoking, but the habit had stuck, a souvenir from his days on the beat when cheap tobacco was a required companion for sleepless stakeouts. The smoke curled around him, drifting toward the blackened ceiling. He exhaled and allowed himself a moment to imagine the thief's perspective, crouching behind sculptures, disabling motion sensors with practiced hands, and navigating the labyrinth of security measures that had so intimidated lesser criminals. This was someone who thrived on danger. Someone who craved the spotlight. He looked at his desk calendar, July 19, 2025. The city was alive, yet at this hour, it felt suspended in time, an intricate diorama awaiting his next move. He opened his notebook and scribbled 2 words in bold capitals: white glove. Underneath, he began listing questions. Maker of glove? Italian, bespoke, who imports such wares to London? Security log, any anomalies in cameras, alarms, guard patrols? Turner provenance, any recent controversies or jealous rivals? Interpol, recent art thefts fitting this MO? He tapped his pen against the page and rubbed his eyes. Across the room, A wall-mounted clock ticked past 1 a.m. He sighed, then dialed a number on the antique telephone. "Sergeant Price," he said when his junior partner's weary voice answered. "Meet me at the National Gallery in 30 minutes. We have a show to stop." He hung up and grabbed his trench coat, a heavy, dark woolen thing, frayed at the cuffs, and his battered fedora. Outside, the rain's drumming grew louder, impatient. Luther flipped the collar of his coat and strode toward the door. As he passed the portraits lining the corridor, long-dead constables frozen in oil, their stern gazes following him, he felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. Each case was a composition, a melody of clues and red herrings that he, as both conductor and detective, would bring to a resolute finale. Tonight's overture had just begun, a stolen masterpiece, an audacious calling card, and a puzzle only he could solve. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the warm glow of his office. There would be paperwork, interviews, and late-night research ahead, but for now, the rain was his accomplice, washing the streets clean and setting the stage for what promised to be the most exhilarating act of his career. With that thought, Inspector John Luther disappeared into the London night, ready to orchestrate his next move in the grand drama unfolding beneath the city's storm-dark skies. Chapter 2, The Forensic Signature. Detective Sergeant Amelia Price arrived at the National Gallery just as the first pale fingers of dawn began to pry back the night. The building's grand facade, its Corinthian columns and carved pediment, loomed against a slate-grey sky. Entrance doors, usually flung open for morning visitors, were tightly sealed behind police tape. Uniformed officers formed a silent perimeter, their breath fogging in the chill air. Inside, the echo of hurried footsteps bounced off marble floors, punctuated by the low murmur of official voices. Price checked in with the station sergeant. "Inspector Luther is on his way," she reported, showing her badge. He was already inside, crouched beside the display pedestal in the rotunda. Price ducked under the tape and slipped into the cavernous hall, her senses tingling with the residual hush of the night's crime scene. The gallery's vaulted ceiling soared overhead, a fresco of cherubs and allegorical figures frozen in plaster. Yet the air felt heavy with something far less celestial, a tension born of stolen art and unanswered questions. Luther rose as she approached, his expression taut. He brushed raindrops from his coat and nodded at the pedestal. "There it is," he said softly. Price stepped forward. The Turner's frame stood empty, its twisted, storm-lashed cliffs and brooding skies no longer filled the space. Instead, in the center of the gleaming plinth lay the glove, a single, immaculate white glove. Price donned latex gloves and knelt. She lifted the glove by its cuff, holding it up to the morning light filtering through the high windows. The leather was supple, almost luminous, and each stitch was invisible to all but the keenest eye. "Italian, I'd say," she murmured. She examined the interior seam, no label, no maker's mark inside, but the leather's texture and the curvature suggested bespoke tailoring. Carefully, she placed the glove into an evidence bag. Luther stood, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "It's too perfect to be an accident," he said. "No prints, no fibers, no trace of DNA. Whoever wore this knew exactly how to avoid leaving a mark." He studied the surrounding area, a faint scuff on one corner of the plinth, a barely noticeable smudge on the marble floor, just enough to glimpse the shadow of a hurried retreat. Price nodded, crouching to inspect the floor. She photographed the impressions with a digital camera, capturing the angle and depth. "Scuff looks fresh. Maybe from a boot heel, slick rubber sole, shallow tread. Nothing like our officer boots." She stood and scanned the perimeter. Motion sensor panels flanked the display. The security guard on duty had reported no alarms, but that might be because the thief bypassed the sensors entirely. Luther pointed to a narrow seam in the wood paneling. "Service entrance paneling, there's a gap here wider than it should be." He tapped the frame. "They may have wedged something to hold a lock open." Price knelt beside him. "Check the CCTV logs," she said. "If our suspect scrambled the sensors, we still might have camera footage, infrared or backup feeds." Over the next hour, they coordinated with a technician, poring over security footage from every camera within 50 meters of the rotunda. All showed normal activity until a dark, featureless shape slipped across the periphery of the frame at precisely 2:14 a.m. The figure moved with the fluid grace of a cat, silent, deliberate. In one angle, the intruder paused to disable a panel, a flick of a wrist, a soft click, and the hallway lights remained dim, the motion sensors untriggered. "Look at how clean that maneuver is," Price said, rewinding the clip. Not a hesitation. Years of practice. She paused the video on a fleeting glimpse of a gloved hand, dark, perhaps leather, with a slight sheen. Not our glove, but a clue. A glove changed to defeat fingerprint readers. Luther tapped his pen against the desk. A professional. And theatrical, leaving the white glove. It's their trademark, their signature. We've seen something like this before. He reached for his notebook and flipped to a list of past art heists. The Silver Fox, an alias for an art thief who struck Paris and Rome last year. Same MO, leave a single white glove at the scene. Price's eyes widened. Interpol sent alerts after the Musée d'Orsay theft. They found the glove at the Louvre break-in, too. She scrawled, Silver Fox, in her notes. That thief was never caught. If it's the same person, we're dealing with an international criminal, one who thrives on daring. We'll notify Interpol, Luther decided. Get them the glove, the footage, everything. If the Silver Fox has come to London, you won't wait long before striking again. He stood and looked around the hushed gallery, as if the empty frame might speak. But why here? Why the Turner sketch? Price considered. It's iconic, everyone knows it. A high-profile target ensures maximum attention. And we have to assume there's more. He's not stealing for the art market, he's performing for the world. Luther exhaled slowly. Then let's give him a show he'll never forget. He closed his notebook and turned to the forensic technician. Bag that glove, tag it as number 001, and send it to the lab. We want fiber analysis, leather tanning residue, everything. No stone unturned. The technician saluted and took the evidence. Outside, the rain tapered to a mist. Inside, the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Luther and Price walked down the rotunda's curved corridor, their footsteps soft on the polished floor. Portraits of art patrons long gone watched impassively from gilded frames. Detective Sergeant Price glanced at her partner. "What's our next move?" she asked. Inspector Luther paused beneath a marble bust of Sir Robert Peel, founder of the Metropolitan Police. He traced the outline of the sculpture with his thoughts. "We dig into our lists, anyone with ties to bespoke glove makers, anyone who's traveled between Paris and London in the last 6 months, anyone who fits the Silver Fox's profile. And we do it fast, before he has time to vanish." Price squared her shoulders. "Let's hunt a fox." With that, the two detectives stepped back into the hallway's light, the thrill of the chase mingling with the damp chill. The Silver Fox had marked his canvas, and Scotland Yard was determined to paint him into a corner. Chapter 3, Lady Carrington's Gallery. The late morning sun filtered through stained glass windows of Penelope House, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished marble floor. Lady Penelope Carrington, our patron and social arbiter, received Inspector John Luther and Detective Sergeant Amelia Price in the grand reception hall. Tall columns flanked an immense tapestry depicting a pastoral scene. Scattered about were sculptures and paintings of every style and era, each one meticulously catalogued in Lady Carrington's exquisitely kept inventory. Lady Carrington herself was a slender woman in her early 60s, her silvery hair swept into an elegant chignon. Even in her fine morning black dress, she carried an air of refined strength. As she led the detectives down a corridor lined with gilded frames, her gloved hands trembled ever so slightly. "Thank you for coming so promptly, Inspector," she said, her voice a melodic whisper. "I confess I was too distraught to wait." They entered the private gallery, a long, narrow room lit by French windows overlooking a terraced garden. The walls were draped in deep burgundy silk, recessed spotlights illuminated each artwork. At the far end, the Turner sketch's empty frame loomed like an accusing eye. Price stepped forward, examining the pedestal where the sketch had rested. "We've recovered the glove," she said quietly, "and we're sending it to the lab now." Lady Carrington's pale blue eyes flickered with relief. A white glove, she murmured. It feels so theatrical. She drew in a breath, then gestured to a plush settee. Please, sit. Luther perched on the edge of the settee while Price remained standing by the pedestal. Lady Carrington sank into a cushion, smoothing her skirt. For a moment, none of them spoke, only the distant humming of the conservatory's air purifier filled the silence. Then, with an imperious sigh, Lady Carrington began. I purchased that Turner sketch nearly a decade ago, she said. It was my favorite piece, an early study of coastal tempest, late in the artist's career. I paid handsomely, of course. It arrived by secure courier, and I had it displayed here ever since. She paused, glancing at the empty frame. Last night, I hosted a small dinner for close friends and associates. Mr. Kint, my new curator, was there. He has impeccable taste, and I believed him trustworthy. Yet now, her voice trailed off. Luther exchanged a look with Price, then turned back to Lady Carrington. You said Mr. Kint was present. Was anyone else in the gallery after dinner? She shook her head. No. After dessert, the other guests retired to the drawing room. Mr. Kint offered to tidy here, ensure the lights were secure. She closed her eyes at the memory. He locked the doors, then bid me good night. I retired shortly after. Price moved to the windows and drew back the heavy drapes, letting in a shaft of light. Did you notice anything unusual in his behavior? She asked. Lady Carrington's brow furrowed. He was distant. Distracted by the Turner, more so than I expected. He lingered by the sketch for an awfully long time, tracing its lines with his eyes. She paused, glancing at Luther as if seeking his unspoken verdict. He claimed he was simply admiring Turner's technique, but I sensed something deeper, an almost possessive fascination. Luther nodded pensively. When did you first hire Mr. Kint? 3 months ago, she replied. He arrived with impeccable credentials, a master's degree in art history from Oxford, recommendation from a renowned Mayfair gallery. He seemed ideal. Her voice hardened. But perhaps I was naive. Price approached Lady Carrington's side. We'll need to interview Mr. Kint formally, she said. In the meantime, could you tell us if any other valuables have been moved or disturbed? Lady Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line. Nothing else. My collection is extensive, 3 rooms worth of old masters, Regency porcelain, rare tapestries, but only the Turner is missing. She rose and walked to a small side table, retrieving a leather-bound notebook. With delicate precision, she flipped through its pages and found a section marked Julian Kint. Here, she said, handing the notebook to Luther. Mr. Kint maintained meticulous notes on each piece in my collection. His entries on the Turner are overlong. Luther took the notebook and leafed through pages of Kint's neat handwriting, detailed descriptions of brushwork, pigment composition, and speculations on the artwork's provenance. One paragraph, underlined twice, read. The Turner sketch transcends mere landscape, it embodies human struggle against nature's indifferent grandeur. To possess it would be to hold a fragment of the sublime. Price arched an eyebrow. Powerful words. Luther looked up at Lady Carrington. Did he express personal ambitions when you hired him? Anything about opening his own gallery, publishing a book? She shook her head. No such talk. He spoke only of cataloguing, preservation, duties of a curator. Her voice wavered. He thanked me profusely for the opportunity. A faint breeze stirred the drapes as Luther closed the notebook. We'll need to speak with Mr. Kint immediately, he said. Would you be comfortable arranging a meeting at your home? Lady Carrington nodded. Of course. He's due here later this afternoon to discuss an upcoming exhibition. She paused, then added in a softer tone, Inspector, do you truly believe he could have taken it? Luther hesitated only a moment. We have to follow every lead, Lady Carrington. He's the only person we know was alone in this room after your guests left. But a confession only matters if it's supported by evidence. Lady Carrington's shoulders sagged. I understand. She led them back toward the gallery entrance, the faint scent of jasmine from the garden drifting in. At the threshold, she paused and placed a pale hand on the door frame. "Please bring me my sketch back," she whispered. "It means more to me than you can know." Luther gave her a measured nod. "We will, Lady Carrington. You have my word." As he and Price stepped onto the gravel drive, he glanced back at the grand windows. Upstairs, behind those panes, the curator waited, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. And somewhere beneath polite smiles and genteel manners, Luther sensed the first chords of a darker symphony, one that would soon crescendo into undeniable truths. Chapter 4, The Curator's Confession. Julian Kint's Bloomsbury townhouse stood incongruously between two red-brick Victorian terraces, its narrow facade painted a stern charcoal. Inspector John Luther and Detective Sergeant Amelia Price ascended the wrought-iron steps beneath a grey mid-morning sky and paused at the black front door. Price knocked firmly. After a tense moment, the door opened, revealing Kint himself, tall, lean, with dark hair silvered at the temples, and eyes that darted behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Inspector," Kint said, forcing a polite smile. His voice quavered ever so slightly. "Detective Sergeant. Thank you for coming. Won't you step inside?" They entered a high-ceilinged hall, its walls lined with framed art catalogues and sepia-toned photographs of gallery openings. Kint led them into a sitting room furnished in minimalist style, pale wallpaper, a single leather chaise longue, and a glass-fronted cabinet containing porcelain vases. Price noted the cleanliness, no clutter, no personal effects, almost nothing that bore the marks of a life in this world. Everything was too orderly, too deliberate. Luther's gaze drifted to the polished parquet floor. Faint smudges betrayed recent activity, a pair of muddy footprints led from the doorway toward the adjoining study. He exchanged a look with Price as Kint cleared his throat. "I understand you have questions about the Turner sketch that disappeared from Lady Carrington's gallery last night." "Yes," Luther replied. "We're here to clarify your whereabouts and any involvement you might have. Will you answer a few questions?" Kint's thin lips twitched. "Of course. I'm eager to help." Price rose and approached the cabinet. Kint stiffened. "Detective Sergeant," he warned, but she merely jotted notes. On the top shelf lay a single leather belt embossed with the maker's mark, Guido Marino, Firenze, the same artisan whose gloves were found at the National Gallery. Price's pen hovered. "Mr. Kint, where did you acquire this belt?" Kint swallowed. "A gift, from a friend." His eyes flicked to Luther's notebook. "May I sit?" he added, gesturing at the chaise longue. Luther nodded. "Please." Kint perched on the edge, his posture rigid. Price kept her distance, arms folded. "Sir," Luther began, "we know you were the last person in Lady Carrington's gallery before the Turner sketch vanished. You locked the doors, ensured the lights were off. That much you've admitted." Kint's throat worked. "Yes, I was alone. But I swear, I didn't take the sketch." "You also know," Luther continued, "that the Silver Fox, an international art thief, left a white glove as his signature. We recovered it, and it matches the craftsmanship of high-end Italian leather goods, gloves, belts, even shoes." He tapped the belt in the cabinet. "This belt is by the same maker. Care to explain?" Kint's face paled. He swallowed dryly, then exhaled. I used to collect merino accessories," he said. "I wanted to feel closer to the art world I admired. But I haven't worn any of them in weeks." Price held up her notebook. "Yet we found mud on your shoes when we arrived. And the belt, it's fresh. You wore it recently." Kint's composure faltered. He rocked forward, clasping his hands. "I didn't steal the Turner," he insisted, voice cracking. "But I admit I went back to the gallery after I locked up." Luther steepled his fingers. "Why?" Restlessness," Kint confessed, eyes downcast. "I was obsessed. I stood before that sketch and I wanted it. I longed to hold it in my own hands, to feel its texture. But I had no plan to remove it." He paused. Then a man approached me. Price exchanged a glance with Luther. A man? Kint nodded. A stranger. Masked, dark clothing, voice muffled. He introduced himself as the maestro. He praised my knowledge of the sketch, my passion. He said he needed someone with access to Lady Carrington's collection, a guide. His breath caught. He tempted me. He said he wouldn't harm the art, he would simply borrow it, leave a token, and return it safely. He promised I'd benefit financially. Luther's eyes narrowed. So you agreed to let him in? Kint closed his eyes, ashamed. He met me behind the service entrance. I showed him the lock mechanism. He disabled the alarm sensors. Then he slipped inside while I waited outside. When he returned, he had the sketch. His voice trembled. He thrust this glove into my hand and disappeared into the night. He said it was to frame me if I ever spoke. Price crossed her arms. Then you gave him the glove to plant at the scene. Kint threw up his hands. He forced it on me. I tried to refuse, but he threatened me. I walked away. By the time I realized what he'd done, it was too late. Luther stood, smoothing his coat. You were the one who admitted being there last night. That's enough for us to detain you. But if you continue to cooperate and help us identify this maestro, it will be noted. Kint's shoulders sagged. Anything, he whispered. I can't live like this. Luther nodded. Good. We'll escort you to Scotland Yard for further questioning. He motioned to Price. Sergeant. As Price read Kint his rights, Luther surveyed the study once more. The room's pristine order now felt sinister, a veneer masking complicity. He mentally catalogued the evidence, the belt, the footprints, Kint's confession of guiding an accomplice. It all pointed to a master manipulator pulling the strings from the shadows. Outside, the sun broke through ragged clouds, casting light on the townhouse steps. Kint, flanked by officers, looked beaten but resolved. Luther followed, thinking of Lady Carrington's shattered tranquility and the Turner sketch lost in the night. In his notebook, he wrote 2 words, the maestro. Underneath, he sketched a rough diagram of the service entrance mechanism. The net was closing around the true culprit, but Luther knew the chase was far from over. The Silver Fox, the maestro, and their deadly duet still beckoned him deeper into London's underworld. And so, with the curator in custody and the master orchestrator still at large, Inspector John Luther prepared for the next movement of this elaborate crime, a symphony of secrets, lies, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 5, Chasing Shadows. Detective Sergeant Amelia Price sat behind the wheel of the unmarked Scotland Yard sedan as dawn broke over Mayfair. The pale light revealed the grand facades of townhouses and discreet galleries that lined Grosvenor Square. Inspector John Luther rode shotgun, nursing a cup of strong black coffee. Between sips, he scanned his notebook, addresses, phone numbers, partial leads gleaned from Julian Kint's confession. The maestro had promised more, boring paperwork, in exchange for cooperation, but the only thing Kint knew was a name scribbled in code and a vague location, Rook and Raven, Lower Brook Street. Here, Luther said, pointing. Number 42. He folded his map and tucked it into his coat pocket. Rook and Raven is supposedly an antiquarian bookshop by day, an illicit fence by night. Price nodded and eased the car to the curb. Outside the shop, a brass sign bore 2 engraved birds perched on a quill. The storefront windows displayed leather-bound tomes and faded maps. A single lamp glowed inside. Luther and Price exchanged glances, then stepped out, badges concealed beneath their coats. They entered quietly. A low bell chimed as the door closed behind them. The shop was cramped and dimly lit, shelves crowding every wall. The scent of old paper and wax polish hung in the air. Near the back, a stout man in his 50s, spectacles perched on his nose, dusted a row of folios. He looked up, eyes flicking toward Luther's lapel, no badge there, and back to the ledger he held. Luther cleared his throat. Afternoon. His voice carried the calm authority of Scotland Yard. We're interested in rare books on art provenance. The bookseller's eyes narrowed. "You won't find anything on the Turner sketch here," he said. "Perhaps next door?" Price stepped forward. "Actually, we're looking for a man named the Maestro. We understand he frequents this establishment after hours." The bookseller's jaw tightened. He replaced the folio carefully and closed the ledger. "I don't know any Maestro," he said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Luther's gaze swept the shelves. "We're not leaving until you answer our questions." He removed his badge and placed it on the counter. "Might I see your log of after-hours visitors?" The bookseller's face paled. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I can't risk," he swallowed. "Fine, go to the back room." He stepped aside, revealing a narrow archway draped with a velvet curtain. Luther and Price passed through. Behind it lay a small office, a single desk littered with envelopes, a rotary phone, and a brass knocker in the shape of a raven. Price reached out and rapped, once, twice. No answer. Luther lifted the curtain. "Mr. Smythe," he called, using the bookseller's name from the ledger. No reply. Price crossed to the desk and rifled through the envelopes. "Look at this," she said, holding up a bundle secured with string and stamped with a wax seal bearing 2 interlocking RS. She peeled it open. Inside were faded telegrams and clipped newspaper articles about art thefts in Florence and Antwerp. One clipping bore the headline, "Master Thief Strikes Again, Silver Fox Leaves Calling Card." Luther examined the telegram. It was addressed at M, and dated 2 weeks ago. Shipment arrives Tuesday. France. Arrange your pickup. His eyes lit. He's coordinating shipments of stolen art through here. He placed the documents back carefully. We need to track that shipment. Price crossed her arms. But we still haven't heard Maestro. He's cunning, he'd never appear in person. Luther nodded. Then let's use the next best thing. He opened his jacket and produced Kint's Service Industry ID badge, Lady Carrington's curator credential. We'll pass as buyers. We'll call ourselves art collectors interested in private sales. They returned to the front room. Smythe, the bookseller, stood behind the counter, arms folded. "I warned you," he said. Luther offered a tight smile. "We hear you have a private sale coming up, Paris-bound cargo." Smythe's gaze flicked to the street. He lowered his voice. "I was told to call only once I'd confirmed the payment." Price stepped forward. "We can help with that." "Inspector?" Luther cleared his throat. "We're prepared to transfer funds now. Show us the consignment details." Smythe hesitated, then sighed. He retreated to the back room and returned with a small notebook. He opened to a page scrawled in cramped handwriting. Lot 13. Title, Coastal Storm, Turner Sketch, recovered. Title, The Bank of the Scene, Monet, stolen. Title, Night Watch, Rembrandt, insured. His finger traced down to a blank line. "There's another slot left for this week," he said. "You'll need to specify what you want." Luther and Price exchanged glances. "We'll take the last slot," Price said, voice steady. Smythe smiled thinly. "Name?" Luther offered the forged name he'd used on countless undercover ops, Mr. Alan Forsyth. Price chimed in, "And Ms. Emma Carter." Smythe jotted names in his ledger. "Payment is due tonight. Meet here at midnight. Bring certified funds. I'll provide a crate and shipping manifest." He handed them a slip of paper with a time and address, an abandoned warehouse in Docklands. As Luther pocketed it, Price's phone buzzed. She checked the text, "Got something. Meet at Covent Garden in 20. She showed Luther. He nodded to Smythe. "We'll be in touch." Smythe inclined his head. They stepped out into the street, their breath steaming in the chill. "Covent Garden," Price said. "Let's hope our informant has real intel." Luther glanced once at the bookseller's window, then at their notes. "We're closing in," he said. The maestro's network runs deeper than we thought. But tonight, we'll cut one more strand. Price started the engine, and the sedan pulled away. As they headed toward the bustling market square, Luther felt the familiar thrill, the chase through London's shadows, each lead a stepping stone closer to the heart of the criminal symphony. The maestro had orchestrated a masterpiece of crime, but he hadn't counted on Scotland Yard's persistence. And now, the next movement was about to begin. Chapter 6, The Maestro's Telegram. Detective Sergeant Amelia Price stepped off the early afternoon tube at Charing Cross, her boots echoing against the station's tiled walls. In her coat pocket lay a crumpled slip of paper, an unmarked telegram she'd intercepted that morning at the Central Post Office. The message, scrawled in block letters on thin yellowing stock, was addressed simply to M, and bore no return address. Price's stomach tightened as she reread its stark contents. Next masterpiece, the crown jewels. Her pulse quickened. If these were the maestro's plans, he had set his sights on Britain's most impenetrable treasure. Price navigated the crowds to the street level, glancing at the clock on the station's grand canopy, 2:17 p.m. She tapped out a message to Inspector Luther, "Meet me at the Tower of London at 3 o'clock. Urgent." At Scotland Yard's evidence locker, Luther had just finished reviewing the Silver Fox's MO files when his phone buzzed. He read Price's text and tossed his pen onto the desk. "Get the car ready," he told the desk sergeant. "We're heading to the tower." By 2:50 p.m., Luther and Price were rolling through the city's bustling streets in the unmarked sedan. Traffic crawled past the historic facades of Guildhall and the Monument, but Luther hardly noticed. His mind raced through the timeline, the Turner sketch heist 1 week ago, the maestro's network uncovered in Mayfair, the clandestine midnight meeting in Docklands that Price and he had narrowly evaded. And now, a direct threat to the crown. They arrived at the Tower of London's main gate with 10 minutes to spare. Grey stone walls loomed above them, the ancient fortress humming with tourists and guards in Tudor uniforms. Luther stepped forward, flashing his badge at the constable on duty. "Inspector Luther, Scotland Yard. We need immediate access to the Jewel House." The constable hesitated, his face unreadable, then radioed inside. Moments later, a tall lieutenant in a dark suit approached. "Inspector, Detective Sergeant, follow me." He led them through a side corridor, past guards at their posts, and into the Jewel House's outer chamber. Soft lighting illuminated the case housing the imperial state crown, the sovereign's scepter, and the sovereign's orb. The room's hushed reverence contrasted sharply with the adrenaline pounding in their veins. Price felt her hand go to her sidearm, instinctively checking its chamber. Luther scanned the perimeter, pressure sensors underfoot, infrared beams crisscrossing the gallery, CCTV cameras strategically mounted. Every conceivable security measure had been employed to protect these relics. Lieutenant Graves cleared his throat. "We've received your request to bolster security. Standard protocol orders a 6-week review for upgrades. However, given your intel," he trailed off, gesturing to a bank of monitors. On one screen, an operator watched real-time feeds from the Jewel House. "We'll lock down the case, increase patrols, and station 2 armed officers inside. But we'll need your full assessment." Luther nodded. He approached the display case and studied the crown's ornate arches and glittering gems. "We can't let the maestro test these defenses," he said. "He's bold enough to strike in broad daylight if he thinks the odds are in his favor." He glanced at the beams. "We'll run a covert stakeout tonight, undercover, inside and outside the tower. If he shows, we catch him in the act." Graves sucked in his breath. "I'll authorize it, but you'll need to coordinate with the yeoman warders and the tower constabulary." He raised his radio. "Lock down all exits after hours, no exceptions." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cobbled courtyard, Price and Luther moved into position. Price took up station near the armory, blending with visitors inspecting the famous armaments. She wore a nondescript blazer and carried a guidebook. Luther, posing as a tourist with a camera slung around his neck, drifted through the crowds. At 5:30 p.m., they rendezvoused in the chapel's alcove. Price slipped the telegram to Luther. "See for yourself." He unfolded it and read the words again, then folded it carefully and tucked it into an evidence pouch. "We need to find the drop point," he said. "The maestro wouldn't send such a brazen message without security. He wants confirmation that the target is under his microscope." Price nodded. "I've already queried my contacts among the Porter staff. One reported a suspicious exchange at the gatehouse ticket booth yesterday, an envelope passed to a man in a dark overcoat." "Good," Luther said. "We'll check the ticket logs." He tapped the officer at the booth on the shoulder. "Mind if we see yesterday's shift roster and any unusual entries?" The officer glanced at his supervisor, then retrieved the logbook. He flipped to the previous day's entries. Sure enough, at 4:17 p.m., a notation read, "Visitor with envelope. No ID shown." The officer shrugged. He paid cash and left immediately. Luther jotted down the entry. "We'll need to review the CCTV from that time block," he said. "And canvass the surrounding streets, especially any alleyways or side entrances." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the tower's floodlights cast long shadows across the moat. Price linked her arm with Luther's. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded, resolve in his eyes. "Tonight, we'll stop the maestro from conducting his greatest heist." They melted into the gathering dusk, two detectives poised on the brink of a dangerous game. Above them, the crown jewels sparkled behind impenetrable glass, waiting for dawn. And somewhere in London's labyrinthine streets, the maestro prepared his next move, unaware that Scotland Yard was closing in, ready to turn his grand design into his final undoing. Chapter 7, Showdown in the Jewel House. Night had settled like a velvet cloak over the Tower of London, and its ancient walls glowed under amber floodlights. Detective Sergeant Amelia Price crouched behind a stone buttress near the Jewel House's side entrance, her breath visible in the chill air. Inside, the imperial state crown and sovereign's scepter shimmered beneath layers of bulletproof glass, guarded by pressure sensors and two armed constables. Price checked her watch by flashlight, 11:47 p.m. Moments later, Inspector John Luther emerged from the shadows, flashlight in hand. He nodded to Price, then slipped through the heavy door into the antechamber. Price followed, moving with practiced silence. They passed rows of steel girders and intruder alarms until they reached the inner sanctum, where the crown jewels rested. The air was tinged with polished brass and old stone. Behind her, Price heard the soft click of the door locking, a coordinated measure to ensure no one could enter unseen. Luther and Price took their positions, she near the control panel for the infrared grid, he beside a display case showcasing the sovereign's orb. Between them stood a narrow aisle lined with CCTV cameras. Each detective's eyes darted to the monitors, none showed movement beyond the dim reflections of their own forms. "Keep close," Luther whispered. "He'll try the windows first, then the service hatch." Price nodded. Her heart pounded. This was the climax they had trained for, the moment when every shadow could conceal a threat. They listened, only the echo of distant footsteps on the stone walkway, the murmur of guards in the outer corridor. At 11:58, they heard it, the faintest scrape of metal against stone. Price's hand tightened on her sidearm as Luther slipped his Glock from its holster. Across the aisle, the display window's outer frame began to shift inward, a hand-sized gap forming as bolts unlatched with a soft hiss. Blue emergency lights pulsed along the floor as the security system registered the breach. "Now," Luther hissed. He lunged forward, pressing his forearm against the glass in case it swung inward. Price sprinted to the control panel, fingers flying over switches. Red lights flashed, infrared beams reactivated, sensors realigned. A siren wailed through the chamber. The figure froze, half-turned toward them. Silhouette tall and lithe, dressed from head to toe in black tactical gear. A mask obscured every feature but two sharp eyes glinting in the emergency glow. The intruder pivoted, scanning for exits. As he raised the smoke bomb in his left hand, Luther shouted, "Freeze!" A plume of violet smoke erupted, filling the aisle with cloying haze. Price recoiled, coughing. The alarms blared, and the lights flickered as the thief hurled a second bomb. Luther charged through the fog, firing a warning shot at the soft leather sole that skidded past him. Heat and smoke churned around them. Price activated her flashlight's strobe setting, desperate to disorient the intruder. Beams of light danced over armor plates and cables on his outfit. Luther caught a glimpse of a silver fox brooch pinned to the thief's chest, small but unmistakable. "Is the maestro?" Luther gasped. Through the smoke, he saw the intruder's hand move toward the crown. "No?" Price screamed, diving toward him. She knocked aside a display panel, sending dice-sized sensors skittering across the marble floor. The intruder staggered, fumbling at his belt. Luther found his target, a jammed screwdriver and a coil of wire. He lunged, grappling for the wire's end. The maestro wrenched free, shoving Price backward. She crashed into the glass of the sovereign's scepter case, a crack spidered but held. The thief sprinted toward the emergency hatch at the rear of the chamber. Luther pursued, bullets pinging off steel beams. At the hatch, the maestro smashed the release lever and threw it open. He paused, smoke swirling around him like a vortex, and glanced back at Luther. In that moment, he slipped off the silver brooch from his lapel and let it fall. It landed with a metallic click on the cold stone. "Now," came Luther's voice. He raised his weapon, aimed for the intruder's boot. The maestro dove through the hatch, kicking it shut behind him. A final flash of Luther's flashlight illuminated his escaping form, a dark shape vanishing into the corridor beyond. Silence fell, broken only by the echo of the hatch's latch and the distant wail of the alarm. Price staggered to her feet, pressing a hand to her chest. "He's gone," she whispered, voice trembling. Luther knelt by the brooch, lifting it carefully with gloved fingers. The silver fox's tail curled into a spiral, its eyes tiny black sapphires. He slipped it into an evidence bag and rose, every muscle tense. "He underestimated our resolve," Luther muttered. "But he left his signature, and one piece of evidence we didn't have before." They returned to the antechamber, sirens still blaring. 2 constables burst in, weapons drawn, but Luther waved them off. He showed them the brooch bag. "This belongs to our suspect." The constables exchanged looks. "We'll secure the scene and sweep the corridors," one said. "Good," Luther replied. He turned to Price. "Call Interpol. Send them photos of this brooch. They'll know who it belongs to." Price nodded, stepping toward the emergency phone. Luther stared back at the jewel house, its treasures untouched behind reinforced glass. He felt a surge of triumph tempered by urgency. The maestro had nearly succeeded in his grandest heist yet, but now they had his calling card, and a foothold into his identity. Outside, the wind had risen, whipping through the tower's turrets. Rain spattered against the stone, as if the storm that had begun with the Turner sketch theft had come full circle. Luther pocketed the brooch evidence and glanced skyward. "Tonight, we wrote our own final note," he said quietly. "But the concerto isn't over." Price joined him, her face illuminated by flashing patrol lights. Together, they stepped out into the night, ready to pursue the maestro through London's labyrinth, until justice's final chord was struck. Chapter 8, Justice's Finale. Weeks had passed since the dramatic showdown beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Jewel House. London's autumn air had cooled to a sharp bite, and Scotland Yard's corridors were heavy with the anticipation of another case. Yet in the corner office of Inspector John Luther, a different atmosphere reigned, quiet satisfaction. He sat behind his desk, hands clasped, studying a thick file labeled Case Closed, Silver Fox and Maestro. Outside, the rain spattered against the window panes in rhythmic drumming, a familiar London lullaby that had once kindled his determination, and now underscored his victory. Detective Sergeant Amelia Price entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She placed one before Luther and took a seat across from him. "It's all over," she said, exhaling a contented sigh. "The Turner sketch is back in Lady Carrington's gallery, pristine as ever. And the crown jewels, never in danger once we intercepted that brooch." She tapped the file. Interpol confirmed they identified the brooch's maker and traced its recent purchase to a Count Alessio Valdemar, Italian nobility, but bankrupt and desperate. Luther nodded, swirling the tea in his mug before taking a sip. Wundermar fits the profile, sophisticated, well-traveled, with an acute knowledge of art history. He used the alias Maestro to cloak his identity. Interpol coordinated with Italian authorities. They arrested him at Malpensa airport attempting to board a private jet bound for Cairo. He paused, wry smile tugging at his lips. He had in his carry-on a notarized document confessing to the Turner theft, presumably his insurance policy, should he be caught. Price grinned. "And what about Julian Kint?" she asked, settling back. Lady Carrington wrote to express her gratitude, and to apologize. She retained Kint's services after all, once he provided information that led us to Wundermar's network. She tapped her pen on the desk. Kint was released without charge, his cooperation pivotal. He's drafting a monograph on provenance authenticity now, perhaps a path to redemption. Luther leaned forward. Every player in this drama had a role, but none more so than the Silver Fox himself. He staged the Turner heist to lure us into his greater plan, the crown jewels. Wundermar thought he could outsmart centuries of security with theatrical flair. In the end, his Silver Fox brooch was his undoing. He tapped the file again. He remains in custody in Milan, awaiting extradition. Outside the window, a taxi swept around the corner, headlights slicing through the dusk. Luther watched for a moment, remembering the night he had first stood before the empty Turner frame, the weight of the case pressing on him like a storm cloud. Now, that void was filled, with art returned, with justice served, and with lessons learned. "You know," he said softly, "there's a kind of poetry to it all." Wundermar viewed himself as a conductor of chaos, orchestrating perfect crimes. But justice has its own rhythm, and its final note always rings true. Price smiled, sipping her tea. "Are you writing that down?" she teased. He chuckled. "Maybe for my memoirs. But I think the better story is how a curator's obsession set the stage, how an international network wove its web, and how two detectives unraveled it, one clue at a time." He closed the file and stood. "Come on, Sergeant. Let's deliver the final reports. Then we'll have a pint at the Black Swan, my treat." As they left the office, the desk lamp's glow receded behind them, yielding to the fluorescent hum of the hallway. Luther paused at the threshold, turning back for a moment to gaze at the file's bold title, Justice's Finale. He imagined the Turner sketch, now safely encased once more, and the crown jewels glittering behind reinforced glass. He thought of the Silver Fox's audacious theatrics and the Maestro's masked menace, and how each thread of intrigue had woven into a tapestry of resolution. Downstairs, the yard's bustle greeted them, the ring of telephones, the tap of typing, the subdued murmur of officers sharing news of the day's arrests. Amid it all, Luther and Price walked side by side, partners bound by shared purpose. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and shining in lamplight. A cold wind carried the promise of new cases, fresh mysteries waiting in the fog. Luther inhaled deeply, savoring the moment. "Ready for the next overture?" he asked. Price smiled, determination sparkling in her eyes. "Always, Inspector." Together, they stepped into the night, Scotland Yard's legacy of justice echoing behind them, and London's endless symphony of secrets unfolding ahead.